In this video, we'll discuss the capacity of a single neuron, that is, the complexity of the computations that it can perform. So we've seen before that in 2 dimensions, if we draw the output or the activation of a given neuron, then it will look something like this, where we'll get some ridge between 2 parts of the space, where the ridge is essentially defined by the orientation of the ridge is defined by the vector W, and the bias will also determine the position of this ridge. So with a neuron that performs this type of computation, we could perform binary classification. That is, if we use the sigmoidal activation function, we could interpret the activation of a neuron as estimating the probability that some input x belongs to the class 1. And so let's assume in binary classification y can be either 0 or 1, and then we could think of the output or the activation of a neuron as giving us what's the estimate of the neuron that the input actually belongs to the category 1. And then the probability that would belong to the category 2 based on the neuron's estimate would just be 1 minus this, because probabilities must sum to 1. And so we could do this if we use a sigmoid, because the sigmoid is bounded between 0 and 1, and so we're always guaranteed that we get at the output or the activation of a neuron a number which can be interpreted as a probability. So this, in fact, this exact form for a classifier is known as a logistic regression classifier. And the way it's performing classification is that if the output of the neuron, so in other words, if its estimate of the probability that x belongs to the class 1 is greater than 0.5, then we will categorize the input into the class or category 1, and otherwise our classifier would output a prediction that the input belongs to the class 0. And so if we were to draw this in 2D, then, and if we looked at what is known as the decision boundary, where the decision boundary is essentially the surface where some input can equally belong to either class 0 or 1, could equally belong to any 2 class, then what we would get actually is that the classifier is performing a linear classification. That is, it's drawing a line between 2 regions, the regions that it associates with one class and the other region that it associates with the other class. It's just drawing a boundary which is actually linear. So in 2D it corresponds to a line, and in more dimensions it would correspond to a hyperplane. So if we have a problem where we want to classify objects described by input vectors into 2 different classes, if we can draw a hyperplane or a line into between these 2 types of objects, then a single artificial neuron could do that for us. It could model that type of decision process. So here's a few examples of simple functions which can be modeled by a linear classifier. So if we have binary inputs that are either 0 or 1, so we have x1 that can be 0 or 1, x2 that can be 0 or 1. And then we want to model the OR function, which takes the OR of x1 and x2. So for 0, 0, it would output 0, so that would be class 0. And for 1, 0, 1, 1, or 1 or 0, 1, it would output 1. So the triangles correspond to class 1. Well, we can see that if we draw this, we can easily pass a line between all the circles and all the triangles, all the zeros and all the 1s. Here's another function, a bit more complicated, the n function over the negation of x1 and x2. Then we get that all of these guys will be of class 0, and this will be of class 1. And indeed, again, we can pass a line between the 2 classes. And we have another example, but instead of negation of x2, where we get a class 1 here and the others are 0, again, we can pass a straight line. So these simple functions can easily be modeled by a single artificial neuron. However, there are many problems in practice that are not well separated linearly. And actually, there are very simple functions that are not even linearly separable. So here's an example of another simple function, the XOR function. So this is a function that outputs 0 if either both inputs x1 and x2 are 0 or they're both 1. And it only outputs 1, so for these two guys, when either one of the inputs are 1. So in this case, here we have 1, here we have 0 for this point, and here this one, x1 is 1, and x2 is 0 for this point. And so in this case, we see that we cannot draw just a single line that would actually separate on one side all of these zeros and on one side all the ones. So it's not linearly separable. And yet it's actually a very, very simple problem. So this suggests that a single artificial neuron will not be sufficient for many problems where we want to perform this kind of binary classification. However, we notice that it's such a simple function that if we had instead plotted on this axis the result of applying the n function over the negation of x1 and x2, like we've seen in the previous slide, and on this axis we actually drew we used as the value on this axis the output of the n function over x1 and the negation of x2, then this point and this point would be collapsed over a single point. And then this point would correspond now to that point, and this point to that point. And so in this case, we could actually draw a single line between the circles and the triangles, between the points associated with class 0 and the points associated with class 1. So what this is saying is that if we compute an alternate representation, a better representation of our input vector, the problem might become linearly separable. And this also suggests that if we have this other representation, which is actually representable by a single neuron, and that's the case for this n function and this n function, we've seen before that we can actually model these two functions by a single neuron, then this suggests that by having other neurons connected by other neurons, which would, so where we have a neuron that computes this, and a neuron that computes that, if we connected these two neurons to another neuron connected directly to these artificial neurons here, then we might be able to compute certain functions that require more complicated computations and a more complicated decision surface. And this will be the main intuition behind developing more complicated multi-layer neural networks, which we'll see in the next video.